Well, hello everyone. My name is Catherine Van Loo. I am part of the Secretariat of the ICRS, the Institute for Corporate Responsibility and Sustainability. And I'm here with Pete Belk, who is Circular Economy Director at BITC. So Pete, welcome. Can you tell us a little more about yourself and about BITC and what you're doing around circular economy?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you very much to ICRS for having me. Good to see you, Catherine. So yeah, I'm Pete Belk, Circular Economy Campaign Director for Business in the Community. I've been working in different sustainability roles for coming over 12 years now, mainly with businesses, but also a little bit of international development work in West Africa as well. For those of you that don't know, Business in the Community is the largest and longest established business-led membership organisation dedicated to responsible business, founded by His Royal Highness the Prince of Wales 40 years ago. And our vision is that the UK leads the world in responsible business, and so we work with our members to continually improve their responsible business practice, leveraging the collective impact for the benefit of communities. So there in a nutshell is what we do, but I lead our circular economy campaign, which is where we're really pushing for the circular economy to become a mainstream business priority. We think that bringing the theory to life for our members through campaigns focused on circular procurement, but also carbon reduction, and looking at projects addressing some kind of stubborn issues that are common to our members, like textile waste and sustainable offices, give us a way to make circular economy real for our members.
Thank you, Pete. And let's start at the beginning. Can you tell us, what circular economy is and why businesses should care about it?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I guess I'll sort of start with the basics for this one, and just a few statistics that I always find shocking whenever I read them. But we use every year in our economy globally 100 billion tons of resources. So that's everything from metals, minerals, fossil fuels to organic materials from plants and animals. And at the moment, just over 8% is recycled and used again. Everything else is essentially lost. So all of that extraction can quite often just be sort of wasted. So to add to that, use of resources across the world has tripled since 1970 and might even double again from today if we continue on our current course. And with that, we would need another half a planet to sustainably support this kind of level of resource use. So what the circular economy does is it's essentially a fancy name for something that we're all actually quite familiar with, getting as much value as possible out of the materials and products that we use in our economy. And just coming back to that basic kind of mantra of reduce, reuse, repair, recycle. And from a business perspective, there's lots of benefits to embedding some of these ideas in your strategies and processes. From reducing the amount of materials that you depend on, lowers your input costs, it lowers your overall carbon footprint. By preventing the extraction of raw materials, we protect forests and biodiversity. And of course, increasingly important for business is that, by lowering your dependence on virgin resources, you improve the resilience of your supply chains as well. The other side of it is that there's a real opportunity for kind of economic growth and innovation. And in fact, Accenture did a study a few years back that estimated that a shift to a more circular economy could unlock up to $4.5 trillion worth of value added to the economy by 2030 through process efficiency, reducing waste, innovating our business models, and in doing so, creating lots of new jobs as well. So lots of opportunity, and it really is just, it makes sense from an efficiency perspective.
Thanks, Pete. And so as we are recording this video, we are the Friday just before COP26. And in the run-up to COP, we've seen a lot of business publishing net zero targets. And circular economy probably is not as much discussed by these companies, but what you say is that actually circular economy can help us build that net zero society. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Really pleased you asked this one, because it's quite an elephant in the room. And if you look at the a lot of the narrative in the run into COP, there are some really obvious emissions from from the sort of the headlines that have gone out there and that we've seen. So one of those is around materials and the role that materials play in contributing to global emissions. So it's actually a massive bit of oversight if we choose to ignore them. So people are familiar with renewable energy, and Ellen MacArthur Foundation, that are kind of one of the big leaders on the circular economy agenda, have done a piece of work that shows that actually 55% of global emissions can quite easily, is probably the wrong word, but can be tackled through a sort of transition towards a renewable energy system. Whereas the remaining 45%, so nearly half of all the emissions that we use, are driven by material and product use and development, particularly in some heavy emitting sectors like food, plastic, steel and concrete. So what they're saying is that we won't be able to achieve net zero, our huge ambition for this decade, unless we change the way that we use materials. And what that means is that we need to design them out of use where possible, so completely stop using them. We need to also switch to renewable materials like wood, for example, in construction, and do a lot more to reuse the materials that we've already extracted. So the circa 92% that currently go to waste, how can we add more value to those? And really, as businesses, we can all play a part. So Circular Economy, another organisation that done some research in this area, found that around 39% of global emissions could be eradicated by 2032 if we were to redesign some key systems like transport, housing and food through adopting more circular principles. Obviously, those are huge challenges, and that's a short time frame, but there's a real opportunity for reduce, reuse, recycle, and so on to play a role. We'll come on to this a bit later, but it's really important that businesses understand what materials they depend on to deliver their products and services, and what emissions relate to those materials. So from extracting those, to processing, to manufacturing, to recycling, end of life, even the energy associated with the use of those products. For service-based businesses, that will mainly be driven by what they buy and your procurement. But for any organization selling something physical, that will be a heavy kind of dependence on materials. So we all need to just get a bit smarter about how we understand what we're using.
Thanks, Pete. And I'd love to bring this a little bit to life. So could you give us example of businesses who have successfully embed the circular economy principle and who've managed to reduce their waste, or even like have managed to design waste out of their processes?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's some really good ones out there, and I guess I've got three actually. Just hopefully we've got time to run through them from a few different sectors. So the first one is Jaguar Land Rover, who people will probably be familiar with as a car manufacturer. They, looking at how they can reduce the overall emissions of the cars that they sell. One of the key ways to do that is by reducing the weight of the materials that they make the cars out of. So lighter vehicles burn less petrol, essentially. So they've looked to move away from heavier steel towards more aluminium construction, but that tends to be more energy intensive as a process to use aluminium. So what they look to do is to actually reinvent the process of creating aluminium by using much more kind of recycled material to reduce the overall kind of emissions associated with the metal they make their cars from. So since 2013, they've basically captured and reused 360,000 tons of aluminium from existing Jaguar Land Rover cars. They've also added in recycled aluminium from household waste, so old, Coke and beer cans, to create a new kind of stronger alloy that they can then make their cars out of. So that's led to a 26% reduction in aluminium production emissions, and that's contributed to halving the overall emissions per vehicle since 2007. But what it's also done from a kind of financial point of view is secured a much more sustainable source of input materials for them at a time when the cost of those materials are going up. So it's increased the resilience of their business model. The next one that I'm a big fan of myself as a beer drinker, is Toast Ale. So this is a beer company who has basically looked at the big issue of food waste. So a third of all food around the world is currently wasted, criminally so. But they found that by introducing old slices of bread into the way that they make beer, they can avoid or reduce the kind of barley that they use in brewing by 30%. They then use the spent grain to feed to animals, and then their hops become compost, which becomes a fertilizer replacement. So all across their chain, they found ways to kind of reuse the materials they depend on to lower kind of the inputs of other sectors. So that's had a big impact on their carbon footprint, tackled food waste, reduced the demand for land to grow barley and so on, and lowered their water footprint as well. So there's a couple there, just that hopefully bring it to life for the audience today.
Thank you, Pete. And I mean, from some of the example you've just given, we can tell that if you're going to successfully embed circular economy, you're going to have to look beyond your own operation. You're going to have to engage with your suppliers and potentially your customers as well. So, can you tell us, how businesses can do that, and what challenges they will face and how they can overcome them?
Yeah, so it's another really good question, and a really a very big question. So I'll try and kind of break it down into a few thoughts around the kind of upstream and downstream sides of that. So on the upstream side, your supply chain and those kind of inputs to your business from your suppliers. Again, I suppose the first thing that businesses need to think about in terms of their supply chain is what's there. So any sort of supply chain sustainability program should always really start with a kind of a mapping process, understanding who your suppliers are, what do they depend on to deliver the services they provide to you, and start to map out some of those kind of materials and emissions hotspots within your supply chain. And it sounds really easy when I say it now. That can be quite a complicated process, but without understanding that, you're going to struggle to make progress. So that's the first thing I would say is to do an audit of what you currently buy. The other kind of tip I would think about with suppliers and the transition towards more circular supply chains is about thinking about value in a different way. So for many years, procurement has been driven predominantly by financial cost. And, the targets that procurement teams have been set have been about keeping your cost base as low as possible within a business, which is still a good mantra. Don't get me wrong, that's important for business to think about. But what that has often ignored is what other costs you're ignoring by just focusing on financial costs. And every purchasing decision will have other impacts within your business. So, for example, are you buying, if you're buying low cost uniforms for your staff, are they wearing out more quickly? And does that mean that you're having to replace them more frequently? Does that impact on the well-being of your staff and your team if their waterproof jacket isn't properly waterproof because it wears out within 3 months of purchase? What are the costs or the impacts of not being able to recycle those items at the end of life? And does that increase your landfill costs as an organization, for example? Or does the reputational risk of seeing your products going straight into the into the dustbin, and the impact that that has on employee engagement, does that have another cost to the business that isn't factored into that initial kind of price-based purchasing decision? So I think as we start to look at the different types of solutions that are more circular, so things with high recycled content, things that are maybe opportunities to rent items as opposed to buy them outright. All of these things would require a procurement team to think a bit differently about what the kind of long-term benefits and costs of that particular product are. And the same goes for for carbon. So by choosing a supplier which has lower recycled content in its items over someone who has high recycled content, arguably there will probably be more carbon emissions incorporated into that product. And if you've set targets to manage those emissions, that's going to be something you're going to need to focus on. So shifting your your definition of value and how you kind of assess what you buy as a procurement team is a really important thing to consider. The other thing I would say is that it's important to think about how you can work with your suppliers to give them the confidence to innovate on your behalf. We found that a lot of suppliers in the uniforms, the workwear sector, where we've done quite a bit of work over the last year, have lots of great ideas, but they don't feel confident enough to pitch them to their clients because they're worried that they're going to be beaten down on price. So how can you extend contract lengths? How can you provide pilot opportunities for suppliers who want to test new ideas that might ultimately provide you with more sustainable? Again, there are incentives you can add through the contracting process that might incentivize higher recycled content, might incentivize take back schemes where suppliers will take products back from you, refurbish them, and then sell them back to you at a lower cost. There are different ways that you can help support that shift to a more sustainable circular supply chain in the contracting process. And then the other one I would say is looking at kind of sector-based collaboration. How can you work with your peers? As for example, the retail sector is around food waste. How can you develop consistent standards so that suppliers that may share a number of clients within your sector can basically develop a single product or service that has value for all of you without having to adapt to different standards that basically sucks up time and cost for them. But that's sort of a few thoughts on the supply chain side. On the customer side and the kind of the downstream side of how you think about your products and services. The first thing I would say is a lot of businesses we speak to are very nervous about this. They don't want to rock the boat. They don't want to upset customers by trying anything that's too radical or too new. But I think in some ways we underestimate our customers at this point in time. And if you look at fashion as a sector where there's a huge amount of kind of churn at the moment and a big shift in customer perception, consumers want to consume differently. Whilst there is still growing demand for fast fashion, and we know some of the problems associated with that sector, the fashion resale market is growing 11 times faster than sales of new clothing and is projected to be worth $80 billion by 2025. So if I were a big kind of clothing retailer, I'd very much be thinking about how I tap into that market and look at where I can rent or sell secondhand clothing to the customers that want to buy that way. Trying different models and testing different ideas can help you differentiate. And again, we're starting to see vehicle manufacturers offering different leasing and rental models, and that enables them to retain ownership of the materials in those products, much like the Jaguar Land Rover example. That's going to be a huge sort of driver going forward. IKEA is another example where they're offering incentives to customers to take furniture items back into stores. That prevents IKEA having to manage forests and chop down trees, if they can recycle products back into new ones and sell them at a lower cost, it provides a loyalty and a customer engagement experience that they wouldn't otherwise have managed with those customers, and brings people back into stores as well, where they might make other purchases. And I suppose there's a nice statistic around how we think about the value that is retained in something that we've already sold as a company. The iPhone retains 48% of its original value if it's reused in some way, so repaired and then resold, but only 0.24% if it's recycled. So the more that we can do to redesign our products so that they can be repaired and that we own that process, the more value we can extract as businesses from that. So a few thoughts there, and there's more I could say, as you probably guessed, but I'll stop there.
Thank you, Pete. And I know some of our listeners will not have really thought about circular economy before. Some also might be in sectors like service-based sectors, and they might just not really understand how that relates to them. So could you just give a few tips on those who are just starting on the journey and starting to think about circular economy?
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I appreciate when we start getting into sort of value retention, different ownership models, the systems get quite complicated quite quickly. And of course, they will vary quite wildly depending on what your sector is. So it's completely different for a food manufacturer as opposed to a vehicle manufacturer, although the principles will be similar. But yeah, so we at Business in the Community have a very strong membership in professional services, financial services, more kind of service-based, office-based organizations. And I suppose the couple of pointers I'd give to any business really would be to start small. So look at your offices, look at those areas where you do have quite sort of direct control. There are some really kind of quick wins you can make through things like recycled office paper, through remanufactured furniture within offices that is lower cost and much lower carbon, but basically looks like new furniture. Really good opportunities to engage your employees around some of that as well. And particularly when we're moving into this kind of flexible working and people aren't exactly sure what offices are going to look like in years to come. Having a flexible, service-based contract for furniture, for IT, will give you greater flexibility and will, reduce your kind of risk exposure on some of those sorts of categories. So there's a real kind of win-win-win thinking about, that sort of. I would definitely direct you to BITC's Circular Office Guide, which goes through all of these sorts of ideas in lots of detail through that lens of the office. The next place I'd think about, and this is sort of broader than just the office, but definitely kind of applies in that setting as well, is procurement. And again, every company buys stuff. The more that we can buy and drive up demand for more circular solutions, more circular providers of those products and services we need, the faster we'll kind of move towards the place that we need to be. So looking at how you embed some of those principles in your procurement team is relatively straightforward. And again, Business in the Community has lots of resources out there that you can look at. WRAP, again, is another good organization to go and peruse as well. For those that are looking to kind of push a bit further and start to look at this, at a bigger scale and more strategically, as with all sustainability endeavors, get your leaders on board early. Some of those statistics I mentioned right at the start should give you pause for thought, and I think will make most leaders sit up and listen. Then that materials mapping process that I talked about, understanding what you depend on, where it comes from, whether it can be replaced with a recycled alternative, looking at how you can start to understand what happens to your products at the end of their lives. Those sorts of questions can start to build a picture of what you should focus on within your circular strategy. Then Really important to think about how you can embed some of these ideas in different functions in the business, particularly within research and development, product development, procurement and marketing. So really trying to get this into the heart of the business and to get people thinking differently about what type of business model and sort of product development process you need to reduce impacts and identify some of those opportunities I mentioned earlier. The other piece is really taking a strong look at where you can use some of these ideas, these kind of circular principles, to reduce your carbon emissions. We're seeing a massive surge in companies setting science-based targets. For any company where your scope 3 emissions, so those emissions that are generated outside of your direct influence in your value chain, a lot of those can be tackled really effectively through some of these circular ideas. So if you want to deliver those quickly, then circular economy is your friend. And actually circular and material-based kind of activities or kind of carbon reduction interventions are the lowest cost on average out of any kind of intervention you can look at within your supply chain, according to. And then, yeah, I think I'll stop there. Those would be the main pointers. There's probably others, but that will definitely keep people busy for the time being.
Yeah, there's so much food for thought here, and I'm sure our listeners will really appreciate that. And we will signpost them as well to the BITC website, and they should absolutely get in touch with you, Pete, if they want to know more or get started on their journey. So, Pete, thank you so much for your time on this, rainy morning. And yeah, we'll speak very soon.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for having me, and yeah, good luck to everyone on their circular journeys.